Suzanne Morphew disappeared without a trace on a quiet Mother's Day in 2020, leaving behind a community in shock and a husband, Barry, who seemed desperate for answers. But as the investigation unfolded, the truth would reveal a chilling secret. Barry, the man who had pleaded for his wife's safe return, was hiding a dark and deadly truth. What appeared to be a simple case of a missing person would soon unravel into a twisted tale of betrayal, jealousy, and murder. Would Suzanne ever get justice, or had her fate been sealed long before that fateful bike ride? In the small, picturesque town of Salida, Colorado, the disappearance of Suzanne Morphew on May 10, 2020, would forever change the quiet community. Suzanne, a 49-year-old wife and mother of 2 daughters, had always been known for her warm smile and active lifestyle. She loved the outdoors and was frequently seen out biking or hiking the beautiful trails that surrounded the town. On Mother's Day, Suzanne decided to take a solo bike ride in the early morning, something she often did to enjoy the fresh air and clear her mind. It was a Sunday like any other, except it would soon become the beginning of a mystery that would captivate not only the town but the entire country. When Suzanne didn't return home by late morning, her husband, Barry Morphew, began to grow concerned. He initially told authorities that he had been away on a work trip that weekend, out of town doing landscaping work for a project. Suzanne's bike, however, was found on the side of the road by a neighbor, untouched and leaning against a tree. Her helmet and water bottle were also nearby, but Suzanne herself was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious injuries, and no indication of what had happened to her. The search for Suzanne began immediately. Local law enforcement, along with volunteers, fanned out across the rugged terrain, combing through the forests and trails surrounding Salida. A helicopter joined the search, circling overhead, while search dogs scoured the area for any scent that might lead to her. The search stretched into days, but Suzanne remained missing. As the hours turned into days, authorities began to consider all possibilities. Was she lost, injured, or worse? Had she been kidnapped? Did she simply vanish into thin air? Every scenario was carefully examined, but there were few answers to be found. Barry, meanwhile, remained a key figure in the search efforts. He appeared on local television, pleading for his wife's safe return, expressing deep worry and anguish. He told reporters that he had no idea where Suzanne might be and was desperate for any information that could bring her home. But as investigators began to look more closely at Barry's movements and behavior, small inconsistencies began to surface. Barry had claimed that he had been working out of town during the weekend, but when authorities checked his alibi, it didn't quite match up. His story about where he had been and when didn't fully add up. Authorities began to question whether Barry's behavior was as genuine as it seemed, but there was still no solid evidence linking him to Suzanne's disappearance. As the investigation continued, Suzanne's friends and family described her as a loving, devoted wife and mother. She had no known enemies, and there was no reason to believe that anyone would want to harm her. However, beneath the surface, Suzanne's marriage to Barry had not been as perfect as it appeared. Some close friends of Suzanne revealed that there had been tensions in the relationship, though Suzanne had never openly discussed any problems. It became clear that, like many marriages, their relationship had its ups and downs. But these revelations only added to the growing mystery surrounding Suzanne's disappearance. The town of Salida, once peaceful and serene, became the focal point of a case that seemed to offer more questions than answers. As weeks passed, the frustration mounted. No body was found, and no clear leads emerged. Suzanne's family held out hope that she would be found alive, but the search grew increasingly desperate. It was as if Suzanne had simply vanished, leaving behind only a few scattered clues and a trail of uncertainty. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Suzanne Morphew's disappearance began to intensify. With no clear leads pointing to what had happened to her, authorities began to focus their attention on her husband, Barry. His behavior, though outwardly distraught, started to raise suspicions. Barry had been the one to report Suzanne missing, and he had been actively involved in the search. Yet, as investigators dug deeper into his background, subtle inconsistencies in his story began to surface. Barry had claimed that he had been working on a landscaping job in a nearby town on the day Suzanne went missing. But when police checked his alibi, it was not as airtight as he had led them to believe. Authorities found that he had left the job site earlier than he had initially said, raising questions about where he had been and what he had been doing during the time Suzanne vanished. His version of events didn't fully match up with the available evidence. In the small town of Salida, where everyone knew everyone's business, Barry's actions seemed increasingly suspicious. As the investigation continued, law enforcement began to piece together details of the Morphew family's life. Suzanne's friends started to recall conversations they had had with her before her disappearance. Some mentioned that Suzanne had been unhappy in her marriage and had even hinted at the possibility of leaving Barry. Suzanne had confided in those close to her about her struggles with her husband, describing a relationship that, on the surface, seemed perfect but was marked by tension behind closed doors. These revelations cast a shadow over Barry's public displays of concern. Was he really grieving his wife's disappearance? Or was he hiding something darker? Authorities also uncovered a series of strange online searches made by Barry in the weeks leading up to Suzanne's disappearance. The searches seemed to reflect an obsessive need to control the situation, with Barry researching everything from divorce settlements to the logistics of how long it would take for someone to be declared dead. There were also troubling financial transactions that raised further alarms. It appeared that Barry had been preparing for something, but the investigators couldn't yet understand what. The deeper investigators dug into Barry's past, the more they found that pointed to a troubled marriage. Barry had a history of explosive behavior, with reports of outbursts in the past that Suzanne had kept private. Some of her closest friends recalled instances where Suzanne appeared nervous or even fearful of Barry's temper. It became clear that their relationship was not as idyllic as it seemed from the outside. Despite these growing suspicions, there was no direct evidence tying Barry to Suzanne's disappearance. Investigators couldn't yet prove that he had harmed her, but the mounting inconsistencies and troubling signs created a chilling picture. The public began to turn on Barry as well. Though he continued to plead for his wife's safe return, his behavior seemed odd. He didn't seem as devastated as a husband whose wife had just gone missing would be. He was calm in interviews, almost too calm. He often made statements that sounded rehearsed or distant, and his public pleas for Suzanne's return felt more like a performance than genuine concern. As the weeks passed without Suzanne being found, law enforcement's focus on Barry became more intense. The case remained a mystery, but one thing was becoming clear: Suzanne's disappearance wasn't just a tragic accident or a random act of violence. Something more sinister was at play. Barry Morphew was no longer just a concerned husband, he was a suspect in a case that seemed to grow darker with every passing day. The question remained, did Barry have something to do with his wife's vanishing, or was there a more complex, hidden truth to uncover? Months passed, and Suzanne Morphew's disappearance remained a chilling mystery. As the search grew colder, investigators began to look for new angles to crack the case wide open. But the breakthrough didn't come in the form of new evidence. Instead, it was a deeper dive into the Morphew family's life and a closer examination of the people closest to Suzanne. It became evident that the case wasn't as straightforward as anyone had hoped. In November 2020, nearly 6 months after Suzanne disappeared, a significant development sent shockwaves through the investigation. A search of the Morphew family property led to a stunning discovery. Among the dense foliage behind their home, investigators uncovered Suzanne's missing cell phone. It had been buried in a remote part of the yard, hidden under a pile of dirt. The phone had been wiped clean, but authorities quickly sent it to forensic experts for further analysis. The analysis revealed a series of troubling findings. For one, The phone contained evidence that Suzanne had been in contact with someone in the days leading up to her disappearance. Investigators discovered messages that hinted at her growing unease in the days before she vanished. In one text, Suzanne had mentioned feeling scared and uneasy about something, though the specifics of her fear remained unclear. Other messages suggested that Suzanne was planning a significant change in her life, perhaps even preparing to leave Barry. These texts were a stark contrast to the outwardly calm picture Barry had painted of their life together. In addition to these revealing messages, Suzanne's phone had photos stored on it that captured moments of her life that were never meant to be shared. Some of these photos appeared to show signs of bruising or injuries, raising serious questions about the physical and emotional toll her marriage may have taken on her. Although these photos were not definitively linked to Barry, the evidence painted a disturbing picture of a woman who may have been struggling behind closed doors, far from the image of a happy family that Barry had portrayed to the public. Further forensic analysis of the phone also uncovered new evidence about Barry's movements on the day Suzanne went missing. Investigators traced his phone's location and found that it had pinged near the area where Suzanne's body would later be discovered. This discovery was a key turning point in the investigation, as it seemed to confirm suspicions that Barry had been much closer to the scene of Suzanne's disappearance than he had initially claimed. His alibi, once considered shaky, was now completely under scrutiny. How could Barry have been so close to the scene if he had been working hours away, as he had told investigators? As the evidence mounted, investigators began to shift their focus entirely onto Barry. Surveillance footage, combined with new GPS data from Barry's phone, placed him in areas he had not been willing to admit to. His every movement, every action was now being analyzed with a fine-tooth comb. No longer just a grieving husband, Barry was now the primary suspect in a case that seemed to unravel by the day. Despite these mounting revelations, Barry continued to maintain his innocence. He still pleaded for Suzanne's safe return and insisted that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But his calm demeanor, coupled with the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, did little to convince the authorities or the public of his innocence. As new facts emerged, it became increasingly clear that Suzanne's disappearance had been anything but a random act of misfortune. Someone in her life, someone close to her, was hiding the truth, and that person seemed to be Barry. The question now was not whether he was involved, but how far he had gone to cover his tracks and what he was willing to do to keep his secret buried. In April 2021, nearly a year after Suzanne Morphew vanished, the case took a chilling turn. The investigation that had dragged on with little progress finally reached a breaking point. Suzanne's remains were discovered in a remote area, not far from the Morphew family's home. The location, tucked away in a rugged part of the Colorado wilderness, seemed to be chosen deliberately, a place that was isolated, difficult to reach, and unlikely to be found easily. When Suzanne's body was uncovered, it was clear that she had not just gone missing, she had been deliberately hidden. Her remains had been buried in a shallow grave, a cruel attempt to erase any trace of the crime. Forensic experts confirmed that Suzanne's cause of death was blunt force trauma. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was no longer just a case of a missing person, it had become a murder investigation. The way in which Suzanne's body was concealed, and the nature of the injury she sustained, pointed to a premeditated crime. This wasn't an accident. Someone had planned Suzanne's death. But who? And why? The authorities wasted no time. They immediately shifted their focus back to Barry Morphew, who had been their primary suspect since the early days of the investigation. Barry had remained in the public eye, constantly pleading for Suzanne's safe return, but the newly discovered evidence made his position increasingly untenable. Investigators found new, damning evidence linking him directly to the crime. DNA samples recovered from the crime scene and from Suzanne's body indicated that Barry had been in close contact with her shortly before her death. There was no doubt now Barry had been involved in his wife's death. But the case didn't end with the discovery of Suzanne's remains. As investigators pieced together the timeline leading up to her murder, they uncovered disturbing details about Barry's actions on the day Suzanne went missing. Surveillance footage, cell phone data, and witness statements all placed Barry in the vicinity of Suzanne's last known location. His alibi, which had seemed plausible at first, fell apart completely. Barry had claimed he was working on a landscaping project far from Salida, but the evidence showed that he had been far closer to home. The authorities had him cornered, and the inconsistencies in his story were too much to ignore. In addition to the physical evidence, Barry's past behavior was scrutinized in detail. Investigators found that Suzanne had been planning to leave him. She had been preparing for a new life, one without Barry. These revelations added a layer of motive to the case. Barry was no longer just a suspect in the murder of his wife. He was a man with something to lose, and his desperation had driven him to make a deadly choice. The thought of losing Suzanne, of seeing her walk away with the life they had built together, may have been more than Barry could bear. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that Suzanne's death had been a result of a violent, emotional outburst, a crime of passion. Suzanne had been the victim of someone she had loved and trusted, someone who had been unable to control his jealousy and rage. It was a tragic end to a life that had once been full of promise and hope. As the case moved forward, the community of Salida, still reeling from the loss, had to confront the truth. Suzanne Morphew had not just disappeared, she had been taken from them in a brutal act, and the man who was supposed to protect her was the one responsible for her death. The dark secrets that had long been hidden behind the closed doors of the Morphew home had finally been exposed, and the community could no longer ignore the horror that had unfolded in their midst. The search for justice was just beginning, but for Suzanne, it had already come too late. In May 2021, a year after Suzanne Morphew's disappearance, the long-awaited moment finally arrived. Barry Morphew was arrested, charged with first-degree murder and tampering with evidence in connection with the death of his wife. For the small town of Salida, Colorado, it was the moment they had been dreading but also expecting. The case that had consumed their community for over a year was now officially a murder investigation, and the primary suspect, Barry Morphew, was in custody. His arrest would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the pursuit of justice for Suzanne. Barry's arrest came after a combination of overwhelming evidence and an airtight timeline that painted a damning portrait of his involvement in Suzanne's murder. The discovery of Suzanne's remains, along with the forensic analysis that linked Barry to the crime scene, was the final nail in the coffin. Barry's cell phone data and surveillance footage placed him near the site where Suzanne's body had been buried. Additionally, the evidence showed that Barry had manipulated the search efforts, pretending to be a concerned husband while secretly hiding his wife's body. As the charges piled up, Barry's public persona began to unravel. Throughout the investigation and media coverage, Barry had maintained his innocence, claiming that he had nothing to do with Suzanne's disappearance. His pleas for his wife's return were broadcast on news stations, where he appeared emotional, begging for her safe return. But as the investigation deepened, more inconsistencies in his story surfaced. His calm demeanor in interviews began to appear more calculated than sincere. The inconsistencies between his alibi and the evidence made his innocence increasingly difficult to believe. The community that had once rallied around him now began to see him in a different light, no longer the devastated husband, but the prime suspect in a horrific crime. As Barry's trial loomed, his defense team focused on discrediting the evidence. They argued that the case against him was circumstantial, pointing to the lack of direct physical evidence linking him to Suzanne's murder. They insisted that the prosecution's case was based on assumptions and speculation, not hard facts. The defense portrayed Barry as a man who was being unfairly targeted, someone who had simply been a victim of a tragic and unforeseeable situation. They claimed that the case was based on little more than the theory that Barry had something to gain from Suzanne's death. but with no solid proof to back it up. However, the prosecution was ready. They presented a compelling case, detailing the physical evidence, the forensic analysis, and the increasingly bizarre behavior Barry had exhibited in the months leading up to Suzanne's death. They described a man who was consumed by jealousy and anger, a man who had watched his marriage fall apart and decided to take matters into his own hands. Suzanne's life, they argued, was tragically ended by the very person who was supposed to protect her. The trial was a grueling affair, with the prosecution methodically laying out the evidence against Barry, while the defense fought to discredit it. As the trial unfolded, the facts of Suzanne's final days became clearer. Suzanne had been planning to leave Barry, to build a life free from his controlling behavior. This realization made the crime all the more heartbreaking. Suzanne had been taken from her family not just by a brutal act of violence, but by the man she had once loved. In the end, Barry Morphew was convicted of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the verdict brought a sense of justice, it could never bring Suzanne back. Her family was left to cope with the devastating reality that the man they had once trusted had taken away the person they loved most. The case of Suzanne Morphew's murder was a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. What had appeared to be a perfect family was revealed to be a facade, hiding a deep well of secrets and lies. In the end, the truth came to light, but at a devastating cost. Suzanne's memory lived on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her, but for the people of Salida, the case would remain a haunting reminder of the horrors that can exist within the most seemingly ordinary of lives.